Dear listeners, thank you for your incredible support in helping our channel grow. We're aiming for 1,000 subscribers, so please support us by subscribing and helping us reach this milestone. Now let's start the story. The desert sun beat down on Jonathan Holloway's neck as he stepped off the private charter at Sacramento Executive Airport. 6 months in Yemen providing security for oil executives had left his skin tanned and leathery, his blue eyes sharper than ever. At 38, Jonathan carried himself with the unmistakable presence of a former Marine. Back straight, shoulders squared, every movement deliberate and efficient. He grabbed his duffel bag and gave the pilot a curt nod goodbye. The man had attempted small talk during the flight, but Jonathan wasn't in the mood. He never was. 15 years in the Corps and another 5 in private military contracting had taught him that words were just noise. Actions were what truly mattered. And right now, all he wanted was to get home. Home. The word felt strange after half a year away. The sprawling 5-bedroom house in Sacramento's most exclusive neighborhood had been Ailey's idea. "We deserve this, Jonathan," she had said, her fingers trailing down his chest in that way that still made his breath hitch. "After everything you've been through, don't you want something beautiful?" He had given in, as he always did with Ailey. The monthly payments were brutal, but the contracting work paid well, more than enough to keep Ailey in designer clothes and Haley in the private school she insisted on. The taxi pulled up to the house just after 3. Jonathan paid the driver and stood for a moment, taking in the manicured lawn, the tasteful landscaping, the gleaming windows reflecting the afternoon sun. It was picture perfect, like something from a magazine. Yet he felt nothing. He walked up the flagstone path, punched in the security code, and stepped inside. "I'm home," he called out, his voice echoing in the marble entryway. Silence greeted him. Then, faint laughter drifted from the back of the house. Moving through the foyer, he passed the living room with its pristine white furniture, untouched, like a showroom piece, and stepped into the kitchen. Through the glass doors, he saw them by the pool. Ailey reclined on a lounge chair, her skin bronzed and oiled, a martini glass dangling from perfectly manicured fingers. At 36, she was still stunning, blonde hair cascading down her shoulders, her toned body maintained through daily yoga and twice-weekly sessions with a personal trainer Jonathan had never met but paid for. And there was Haley, their 16-year-old daughter, floating on an inflatable swan in the pool, phone held above her face as she scrolled endlessly, occasionally snapping selfies with practiced pouts. Neither had noticed him yet. Jonathan stood there for a full minute, an outsider in his own home. A familiar hollowness expanded in his chest, the same emptiness he'd felt in Fallujah, in Kandahar, in a dozen other hellholes where he had watched men die and killed to stay alive. Sliding open the glass door, he stepped onto the patio. Ailey's eyes flickered toward him, widening, not in joy, but in surprise. "Jonathan," she said, straightening and setting her drink down. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." Jonathan set his bag down. "Caught an earlier flight." Haley glanced up from her phone, her gaze barely acknowledging him before flicking back to the screen. "Hey, Dad," she muttered, the words tossed out like spare change to a beggar. "Haley," he said, his voice softening despite himself. No matter everything else, something in him still ached at the sight of his daughter. She had been 7 when he first deployed, still running to the door to greet him, still looking at him like he was a hero. Now she wouldn't even look him in the eye. "Well, this is a surprise," Ailey said, standing and adjusting her bikini. She approached him, pressing a dry kiss against his cheek. She smelled of suntan lotion, expensive perfume, and something else, cologne. Men's cologne. "Let me get you a drink," she said, brushing past him into the kitchen. "You must be exhausted." John followed, watching as she poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass. Her movements were fluid, practiced, beautiful, in their way. Just like the rest of her. Just like this house. Just like their life. All of it beautiful. All of it hollow. "How was it?" she asked, sliding the glass toward him across the kitchen island. "The job?" John took a sip, the bourbon burning pleasantly down his throat. "Same as always." "Dangerous? Boring? Somewhere in between?" He shrugged. Ailey nodded, her eyes skimming past his, never quite meeting them. "Well, we've been busy here too. Haley's been doing great in school, straight A's last semester." A lie. John had checked Haley's grades before leaving. Mostly C's, with an A in math. "And I've been working on redecorating the guest rooms," Ailey continued. "Wait till you see what I've done with the West Wing." The West Wing. As if they lived in a mansion and not just an oversized house with a mortgage that kept John working in war zones well into his 40s. "Sounds great," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The patio door slid open, and Haley walked in, water dripping from her swimsuit onto the imported Italian tile. She didn't glance up from her phone as she passed them. "Haley," Ailey called, your father's home. Don't you have anything to say? Haley sighed dramatically before turning. Welcome back, Dad. Her tone made it clear. His return was an inconvenience, not a celebration. Are we still going to Aunt Carol's for dinner? Brienne's having a pool party, and I told her I'd be there by 9. There was no Aunt Carol. No dinner plans that John knew of. We'll see, Eiley said quickly. Go get changed, honey. Haley rolled her eyes and disappeared upstairs, leaving a trail of wet footprints behind her. Carol invited us for dinner, Eiley explained, topping off her own glass with something clear and expensive looking. Just a casual thing. I was going to tell you tomorrow when you got in. John nodded, not bothering to point out the lie. I should shower, he said instead. Been traveling for almost 20 hours. Of course, Eiley said, relief flickering across her face. Take your time. We're not expected until 7. Upstairs, John stood under the hot spray of the shower, letting the water pound against his tense muscles. The bathroom was another of Eiley's renovations. Marble and glass everywhere. A shower big enough for 4 people. A tub that could double as a small pool. His mind drifted back to their first apartment. A 1-bedroom walk-up near the base, second-hand furniture from Goodwill, a shower so small his elbows hit the walls when he washed his hair. Eiley had laughed about it then, called it cozy, said they didn't need anything fancy as long as they had each other. When had that changed? Had she started needing more? Or had she always been this way, and he had just been too blind to see it? John stepped out of the shower and wiped the steam from the mirror. The face staring back at him was weathered, lines etched around his eyes and mouth from years of squinting in the desert sun and gritting his teeth through firefights. A 3-inch scar ran along his jawline, a souvenir from Kandahar. His body was lean and corded with muscle, built for function, not show. He pulled on a pair of jeans and a clean black t-shirt, then reached into his duffel for the small velvet box he'd picked up in Dubai. Inside was a platinum necklace with a single diamond pendant, elegant, understated, something he thought Eiley might like. John hesitated, then tucked the box back into his bag. The moment didn't feel right. Nothing did. Downstairs, he found Eiley on the phone, speaking in hushed tones that stopped the instant she saw him. I was just about to go, she said quickly into the receiver. Talk later. She hung up and flashed him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just Carol confirming dinner. John nodded, letting the lie linger between them like smoke. Haley's still getting ready, Eiley continued, moving to the liquor cabinet and pouring herself another drink. You know teenagers. Yeah, John said, though he didn't. Not really. He had missed most of Haley's teenage years, deployed or on contract jobs, until the distance between them had grown into something vast, a chasm he had no idea how to cross. Eiley leaned against the counter, the motion accentuating her curves. She had changed into a tight black dress. New, expensive. So, she said, tell me about Yemen. Was it exciting? John shrugged. It was a job. Did you have to kill anyone? The question carried a strange eagerness, as if she were asking about an exotic meal he'd tried. No, he lied. There had been 2 incidents, for men total, but he never talked about that part of the job. Not with Eiley. Not with anyone who hadn't been there. Oh, was that disappointment in her voice? Well, that's good, I guess. An awkward silence settled between them. Once, they could talk for hours. Now, after 6 months apart, there was nothing left to say. I'm going to check the security system, John said finally. Make sure everything's working. Relief flickered across Eiley's face. Good idea. I think the one in the garage has been acting up. John moved through the house, methodically inspecting each window, each door, each security panel. It was a ritual, his way of reclaiming control over his environment after months in places where control was an illusion at best. The garage was last. He stepped inside and flicked on the light. Eiley's white Mercedes SUV. Haley's brand new BMW, a 16th birthday present he'd paid for but hadn't been home to give. And an empty space where his truck should have been. Looking for your truck? John turned to find Haley standing in the doorway, eyes on her phone but smirking at him. Mom sold it, she said, her voice carrying a hint of malice. Said you didn't need it since you're never here anyway. John felt a flicker of anger but kept his face neutral. The truck had been 3 years old. Paid off. Reliable. Selling it made no financial sense. When? He asked evenly. Haley shrugged, thumbs tapping across her phone screen. Couple months ago, after some guy named Royce helped her pick out a new one for you. She looked up then, her gaze glinting with something like satisfaction. Guess it's a surprise. Roy. The name meant nothing to him. Mom's friend, Haley added. The word weighted with meaning even a teenager could grasp. He knows a lot about cars. And investing. And Mom. John kept his expression blank, though something cold and hard settled in his stomach. I see. We're leaving in 20 minutes, Haley said, already turning away. Mom says we're something nice. Carol's new boyfriend is some big-shot real estate guy, and she wants to impress him. More lies. John was beginning to wonder if anything in this house was real. He went to the master bedroom and opened the closet. Half of it belonged to Ailey. Racks of dresses, shoes, handbags, all meticulously organized by color and season. His section was sparse in comparison. A few suits, jeans, t-shirts, and button-downs for the rare social events Ailey dragged him to. At the back, hidden behind his winter coats, was a small safe. John entered the combination, Haley's birthday, and opened it. Inside was his backup Glock 19, along with 2 spare magazines and a box of ammunition. He checked the weapon out of habit, cleared it, then put it back. Beside it sat a neat stack of cash, 20,000 in hundreds, his emergency fund. A passport under a different name. Operational security. Old habits from the Marines, reinforced by years in private contracting. Also in the safe was a small velvet pouch containing his grandfather's dog tags and the Purple Heart he'd earned in Korea. John touched them briefly, drawing strength from the connection to the man who had taught him about duty, honor, and the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. "Jonathan, are you ready?" Ailey's voice called from downstairs. John closed the safe, grabbed a dark blue button-down, and headed down to join his family. The drive to Carol's was thick with unspoken words. Ailey chatted nervously about neighborhood gossip, people John had never met, events he had missed. Haley remained glued to her phone, occasionally snorting with laughter at something on the screen, but never sharing the joke. John drove in silence, watching Ailey from the corner of his eye. She was fidgety, anxious, checking her own phone every few minutes as if waiting for something or someone. They pulled up to an upscale restaurant downtown. Valet parking, white tablecloths, waiters in bow ties. No sign of Carol. "I thought we were going to your sister's," John said as they were led to a table. Ailey's laugh was too high, too brittle. "Change of plans. Carol's oven broke, so we're meeting here instead. They should be here any minute." Another lie. Carol, if she even existed, never showed. Instead, they ate an uncomfortable meal. Ailey drank too much wine. Haley sulked over her untouched salmon. John sat in silence, watching them both, more certain than ever that something was very wrong in his house. After dinner, Ailey was too drunk to drive. John took the keys, helped her into the passenger seat, and drove them home through the warm California night. "You're such a good man, Jonathan," Ailey slurred, her hand landing heavily on his thigh. "Too good for me. Always were." It was the most honest thing she had said since he'd been back. At home, John helped Ailey upstairs and into bed. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow, snoring softly, one arm flung across the empty space beside her. For a moment, he stood looking down at her. This beautiful stranger he had married 17 years ago. Had he ever really known her? Or had he been in love with an illusion all along? John turned away and quietly closed the bedroom door behind him. Downstairs, the house was dark and silent. Haley had vanished into her room the moment they got home, her door slamming, music thumping through the walls. John poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and stepped out onto the back patio. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. He sank into a lounge chair, taking a slow sip, feeling the tension of the day finally start to unwind. Then, movement from inside the house caught his attention. Haley was in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, pacing back and forth in front of the island. Through the glass, John caught snippets of her conversation. "Such a disaster. No, he doesn't suspect anything. Total loser. Mom's handling it." John remained perfectly still, his body instinctively slipping into the practiced stillness he had perfected during long surveillance missions. Haley hadn't noticed him sitting in the shadows. She disappeared from view, then reappeared moments later in the hallway, still talking. "Next, we probably the cabin." "Oh, he won't. Mom says he'll sign anything if she cries enough." John took another sip of bourbon, letting the information settle. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture he didn't like, but one that didn't surprise him. He waited until Haley had gone back upstairs before re-entering the house. Instead of heading to the master bedroom, he made his way to Ailey's home office at the back of the house. The room, like everything Ailey controlled, was meticulously organized, matching filing cabinets, color-coded folders, a top-of-the-line computer on a sleek glass and chrome desk. John sat down and powered on the computer. A password prompt appeared. He typed in the same one Ailey had used for years, Haley's name and birthday. The screen unlocked. For the next hour, John methodically sifted through Ailey's emails, financial records, and browser history. The story they told was clear enough. Royce Calloway, 42, CEO of a real estate development firm with questionable financials, in a relationship with Ailey for at least 18 months, based on their emails. Joint accounts John knew nothing about, funded by transfers from their shared assets. A cabin in Lake Tahoe, purchased 6 months ago while John was deployed, Eiley and Roy's names on the deed. And divorce papers, already drawn up, waiting to be filed. Terms that would leave John with nothing, while Eiley walked away with the house, the investments, and half his military pension. All of it carefully planned. All of it waiting for John's signature. He closed the browser, cleared the history, and shut down the computer. Then, with practiced ease, he picked the lock on the filing cabinet. Inside, more evidence. Bank statements. Property records. Even photos of Eiley and Royce together, smiling into the camera with the casual intimacy of longtime lovers. John replaced everything exactly as he had found it and left the office. In the hallway, he paused, listening. The quiet sounds of the house. Eiley's soft snores from the master bedroom. The muffled bass from Haley's stereo. The hum of the refrigerator. The steady tick of the expensive clock in the foyer. John went to the guest room and lay down on the bed, fully clothed, staring up at the ceiling. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he processed, his mind working through the information with the same methodical precision he applied to mission planning. By morning, he knew exactly what was happening, and he was already forming a plan of his own. The next few days fell into an uneasy routine. Eiley, recovering from her hangover, was overly attentive, making his favorite breakfast, asking about his plans, touching him more than she had in years. Haley remained distant, disappearing with friends most of the day, barely acknowledging his presence when she was home. John played along, pretended he noticed nothing amiss. When he mentioned wanting to check on his investments, Eiley quickly volunteered to handle it. When he talked about signing Haley up for SAT prep courses, Eiley assured him she'd take care of everything. All the while, John watched, waited, gathered information, building a complete picture of the trap they were setting for him. Then, on the 4th night after his return, he got the confirmation he'd been waiting for. It was past midnight, the house dark and silent. John, pretending to sleep in the guest room, hadn't stirred when Eiley accepted his excuse about jet lag and not wanting to disturb her. Now, he sat by the window, watching the front drive. A car pulled up, sleek, black, and expensive, but unremarkable. A man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, moving with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Royce Calloway. John watched as Eiley slipped out the front door, wrapped in his silk robe, and rushed into Roy's arms. They kissed hungrily, right there in the driveway, not even attempting to hide. God, I've missed you. Eiley's voice carried clearly through the night air. It's been torture having him back, she added, clinging to Roy. Just a few more days, Royce murmured, his hands sliding down to grip her butt. Then the cabin, like we planned. Is he buying it? Eiley laughed, a brittle, sharp sound like breaking glass. Completely. I told him we needed family time, a chance to reconnect. He's so desperate to fix things with Haley, he'd agree to anything. And she's on board? Royce asked. 100%. Daddy's little girl hates him now, thinks he abandoned us. It's perfect. They kissed again, then Eiley pulled back. You should go. I'll see you Friday. Can't wait, Royce said, giving her another squeeze. By the way, I've been looking at places in Europe. After the divorce, once we've liquidated everything, I think Monaco would suit us. Monaco? Eiley sighed dreamily. I've always wanted to live somewhere glamorous. Royce slipped back into his car and drove away. Eiley stood there watching until his taillights vanished, then turned back inside, pausing at the hall mirror to check her appearance before heading upstairs. John remained by the window long after she was gone. His face was unreadable. His eyes were cold. Everything had fallen into place now. The cabin trip, the waiting divorce papers, the plan to drain him dry and disappear to Europe with his money. But they had made a critical mistake. They'd underestimated him, treated him like some clueless civilian who wouldn't see the ambush coming. John had survived 15 years in the Marines and another 5 as a private military contractor. He'd made it through Fallujah, Kandahar, and a dozen other hellholes where far smarter, far deadlier men had tried to kill him. Eiley and Royce had no idea who they were dealing with. 2 days later, Eiley proposed the trip. Just the 3 of us, she said over breakfast, resting a hand on his arm, her eyes wide and earnest. Like old times. Before all the deployments. Before everything got so complicated. That sounds nice, John said, smiling just enough to let hope flicker in his eyes. I'd like that. Really? The surprise in her voice was almost comical. She had expected resistance. Really, John confirmed. I've been thinking a lot since I got back. About us. About Haley. I want to fix things. Relief washed over Eiley's face. That's great, John. I want that too. The lies came so easily to her. Even now, knowing what he knew, he had to admit, it was impressive. When were you thinking? He asked. This weekend. We could leave Friday, come back Sunday. The cabin's only a few hours away. Reno area? he asked casually. Eiley hesitated, just a fraction too long. Near there. How did you know? John shrugged. Just a guess. Lots of cabins around Reno. Sounds perfect. Eiley's smile was dazzling. I'll let Haley know it's confirmed. She hurried off to make her call. To Haley. Or to Roy? John couldn't be sure. He sat finishing his coffee, mentally reviewing his own preparations. His important documents were secured. A significant sum had already been transferred to offshore accounts Eiley knew nothing about. The cash from his safe was now hidden elsewhere. His backup weapon was secure. Most importantly, he had done his research on Royce Calloway. The man wasn't just having an affair with Eiley. He was running a sophisticated real estate fraud scheme, using shell companies to hide assets and evade taxes. The kind of white-collar crime the FBI took a very keen interest in. An anonymous tip had already been filed, packed with enough evidence to ensure a thorough investigation. But that was just insurance. John had other plans for Roy. Friday morning dawned clear and warm. John loaded their bags into Eiley's Mercedes SUV, noting that Haley seemed unusually enthusiastic about the trip, even helping with the luggage without being asked. I wish we could take your new truck, Eiley said as they pulled out of the driveway. But it won't be delivered until next week. Another lie. There was no new truck. This is fine, John said easily. Haley can pick the music. Haley, surprised at being included, actually smiled at him, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in years. For a moment, John felt a pang of something like grief. In another life, in a different family, that smile might have meant something real. They drove east out of Sacramento, climbing into the Sierra Nevada foothills. Eiley chatted about the cabin, the lake, the hiking trails nearby. Haley eventually put down her phone and joined in, describing a shopping trip she and Eiley had taken the previous week. To an outside observer, they would have looked like a normal, happy family heading off on vacation. John played his part perfectly, asking questions, laughing at their stories. Every inch the oblivious husband and father. For hours into the drive, they turned off the main highway onto a smaller road that wound deeper into the desert outside Reno. We'll need to stop for gas soon, Eiley said, glancing at the fuel gauge. There's a station about 20 minutes ahead. John nodded, watching the landscape shift. The trees thinned, replaced by scrubby desert brush and rocky outcroppings. They hadn't passed another car in at least 30 minutes. Should be just around this bend, Eiley said, slowing as they approached a curve in the road. The gas station appeared, a lonely outpost in the empty desert. One building, 2 pumps, a small convenience store. No other cars in sight. Eiley pulled up to the pump. I need to use the restroom, she said, her voice just a touch too casual. Haley, you should come too. It might be a while before we get to the cabin. Haley nodded, unbuckling her seatbelt with unusual quickness. Yeah, good idea. John smiled at them both. I'll fill up the tank. He got out, started pumping gas, and watched from the corner of his eye as Eiley and Haley disappeared inside. They were taking their time, Eiley buying something at the counter, Haley lingering by the door. John finished filling the tank, replaced the nozzle, and closed the gas cap. Then he stretched, glancing around at the endless desert, feeling the sun hot on his face. The door swung open. Eiley and Haley emerged, moving quickly toward the car. John took 2 steps back from the vehicle, hands loose at his sides. Eiley slid into the driver's seat. Haley jumped into the passenger side. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Eiley's window rolled down. Her face was flushed, excitement and malice burning in her eyes. Let's see if Daddy can make it back home, she shouted, her voice high and wild. Haley laughed, sharp and cruel. Bye, Dad. Have a nice walk. The SUV tore out of the gas station in a spray of gravel, fishtailing before gaining traction on the asphalt. Eiley floored it. The Mercedes accelerated down the empty desert road, dust billowing behind it like a shroud. John didn't move, didn't chase after them, didn't yell. He simply stood there, watching as the vehicle grew smaller in the distance. Anyone else might have panicked, might have raged or despaired, abandoned in the middle of nowhere by their own family. But John Holloway simply turned and walked into the convenience store. The clerk, a bored-looking, middle-aged man, glanced up from his phone. Looks like your ride left without you, he observed. John nodded. Looks that way. Need to call someone? Yes, John said calmly. I'd like to make 2 calls, actually, and I need to buy a few things. The clerk pushed the store phone across the counter. Help yourself. Payphones went extinct about the same time as the dinosaurs. Thanks. John picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Mitchell, it's Holloway. I need a favor. 20 minutes later, John ended his second call and handed the phone back to the clerk. Then he collected his purchases, a prepaid phone, a bottle of water, sunglasses, and a baseball cap, and paid in cash. Good luck, man, the clerk said as John headed for the door. John paused, looking back. Ex-wife? A ghost of a smile flickered across John's face. Current wife, for now. Outside, he sat on a bench at the side of the building, sipping his water and watching the empty road. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, the desert heat already starting to fade. Most men would have been angry, would have let rage and humiliation drive their actions. But John had learned long ago, emotion was the enemy of effectiveness. In Fallujah, in Kandahar, in a dozen other hellholes, he'd seen what happened to men who let their feelings override their training. So he sat, patient and still, waiting for his ride, his mind clear, his focus absolute. Ailey and Haley thought they'd left him stranded, thought they'd broken him. They were wrong. They'd only set him free. A dark SUV appeared on the horizon, drawing closer until it pulled into the gas station. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with a military haircut, got out and approached. Holloway. A nod. Mitchell. John stood, gathering his few belongings. Appreciate this. No problem. Any ex-Marine who calls, I come running. Where can I take you? John looked down the empty road, in the direction Ailey and Haley had disappeared. Sacramento. Got some things to take care of. Mitchell nodded, asking no questions. Men who'd served knew when to talk, and when to shut up. As they drove away from the gas station, leaving behind the scene of his family's betrayal, John felt nothing. No anger, no pain, no fear. Only a cold, hard certainty about what came next. Ailey, Haley, Roy, they thought they'd won. Thought they'd rid themselves of a man they saw as nothing more than a walking ATM. A fool to be manipulated and discarded. But they'd made a fatal mistake. They left him alive. And Jonathan Holloway was not the kind of man who forgave or forgot. He was the kind who survived. The kind who waited. The kind who won. As the desert landscape rolled past the window, John began to plan. Mitchell dropped him off at a nondescript motel on the outskirts of Sacramento just after midnight. No questions asked. No explanations needed. Just one warrior helping another. You sure this is where you want to be? Mitchell asked as John stepped out of the SUV. It'll do for now, John replied, offering his hand. Thanks again. Mitchell clasped his hand firmly. Whatever you're into, brother, watch your six. Always do. John checked into the motel under a false name, paying cash for a week up front. The room was basic but clean, a bed, a bathroom, a small desk, an older TV. He'd stayed in far worse places. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he powered up the prepaid phone he'd bought at the gas station. No smartphone, nothing traceable, just an old-school flip phone, good for calls and texts. He dialed a number from memory. Stone Security, how may I direct your call? A crisp female voice answered after 2 rings. This is Holloway. For Jensen. Authorization, Delta 97 Tango. One moment, Mr. Holloway. A click. Then a deeper voice came on the line. Holloway. Wasn't expecting to hear from you for another month at least. Plans change, John replied. I need some work. Off the books. Jensen didn't hesitate. Surveillance or intervention? Surveillance. Domestic. 3 targets. Location? Sacramento area. Timeline. Starting immediately. Duration unknown. Payment method? The usual account. Jensen grunted. Done. Sending coordinates for equipment pickup. 24 hours. Appreciated. A pause. Then Jensen asked, one question, Holloway, this personal? John considered his answer. Call it housekeeping. Understood. Watch yourself. The call ended. John set the phone down and stretched out on the bed, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. 2 hours later, he was still awake. Not restless. Not anxious. Just thinking. Calculating. Planning every move with the same methodical precision that had kept him alive in combat zones for 15 years. By the time dawn broke, John had his strategy mapped out. Ailey, Haley, and Royce wouldn't know what hit them. Step 1, establish surveillance. Know their movements, their patterns, their vulnerabilities. Step 2, secure resources. Money, identification, weapons, if necessary. Step 3, disappear. Become a ghost. Someone they wouldn't see coming. Until it was too late. For the next 3 days, John remained in the motel, venturing out only to collect the surveillance equipment Jensen had arranged and to establish a new base of operations. A small apartment in a nondescript building on the opposite side of the city from his former home. Rented under a false name. Paid 6 months in advance. In cash. Then he got to work. He set up monitoring on Ailey's phone. Haley's social media accounts. Roy's email. Information poured in, filling in the blanks of their betrayal. Ailey and Haley had returned from the cabin after just one night, already moving on to the next phase of their plan. They'd reported John missing to the local police, not out of concern, but to establish a paper trail. He's been acting strangely since he got back, Ailey told the officer, her voice trembling convincingly. I'm worried he might be unstable. Meanwhile, Royce had moved into the house, not even bothering to be discreet anymore. They were liquidating assets, transferring funds, preparing for their escape to Europe. Once John was declared legally dead, Haley was fully complicit, already calling Royce dad and posting about her excitement for their fresh start on private social media accounts she believed were secure. They were vultures, picking clean the carcass of his life before he was even buried. John watched it all unfold with detached interest, like a scientist observing specimens under glass. No anger, no betrayal, no hurt. Those emotions were luxuries he couldn't afford. Instead, he focused on the weak points in their plan. The arrogance, the carelessness, the assumption that he was as good as dead. On the 7th day, he was ready to make his first move. It was time to let them know that the man they'd left behind wasn't gone. He wasn't broken. He was coming for them. 6 weeks later, in the sprawling Sacramento mansion, Ailey Holloway lounged by the pool, a glass of champagne in her perfectly manicured hand. At 36, she'd already consulted with the top plastic surgeons in Beverly Hills about the work she'd have done once the money cleared. A little lift here, some Botox there. Royce liked his women young, and she intended to stay that way. Any word? Royce asked, emerging from the house in swim trunks that showed off his toned physique. At 42, he still had the confidence of a man who knew his worth, and the worth of everything else. Ailey shook her head, smiling lazily. Nothing. He's just gone. She took another sip of champagne. The police gave up after a month. Said he probably just left. Abandoned us. She laughed, the sound light, bubbly, dripping with victory. If only they knew. Royce settled into the lounge chair beside her, pouring himself a glass from the bottle, chilling in the ice bucket between them. And the money? All transferred, Ailey confirmed, satisfaction evident in her voice. His military pension is now coming directly to me, as his concerned wife. The investment accounts are cleared out. The house is in my name only. He signed it over to me last year when he was deployed. She laughed again. He was so trusting, so stupid. Royce raised his glass. To fresh starts. Ailey clinked hers against his. And to John Holloway, wherever he is. Her smile widened. May he never find his way back. Inside the house, Haley sprawled across the living room sofa, scrolling through her phone with one hand while the other dipped lazily into a bag of expensive imported chips. At 16, she had already mastered the art of entitlement, wearing it as comfortably as the designer clothes her mother bought her. Mom, she called out, not bothering to get up. Tiffany invited me to Cabo for spring break. Her dad's letting us use the jet. Can I go? Of course, sweetie, Ailey called back from the pool deck. Use the black card for whatever you need. Haley smirked, already mentally shopping for new bikinis. Life was perfect now that he was gone. No more lectures about grades or college applications. No more disappointed looks when she came home late. No more awkward attempts at father-daughter time. Good riddance. She tapped out a text to Tiffany. Cabo is a go. Mom said use the black card for everything. 3 dots appeared, then Tiffany's reply. Your mom is the coolest. Not like your dad. LOL. Haley grinned, fingers flying over the keyboard. What dad? She snickered at her own joke. It had been weeks since they'd left John at that gas station in the middle of nowhere. Weeks with no sign of him. No word. No trace. He'd probably hitchhiked to some other state, too humiliated to show his face again. Whatever. She had Royce now. Rich, cool Roy. Roy, who bought her a BMW and never asked about homework. Roy, who was going to take them all to live in Monaco once the divorce was final. Not that John's signature was even needed anymore. After 30 days missing, Ailey had filed for emergency dissolution of marriage on grounds of abandonment. The judge had been sympathetic to the tearful wife and daughter. It was only a matter of time before everything was official. Haley switched apps, snapping a quick selfie with her signature duck face. Caption, living my best life. Hashtag blessed. The likes started rolling in immediately. Life was good. Night fell. Royce had gone back to his penthouse downtown, still keeping separate residences for appearance's sake until the divorce was final. Ailey and Haley ordered from the most expensive sushi place that delivered, then curled up on the couch to watch their favorite trashy reality show. We should go on that, Haley mused, nodding toward the TV, where a group of beautiful people in minimal clothing schemed and backstabbed for prize money. We'd totally win. Ailey laughed, running her fingers through her daughter's hair. You think so? What would our strategy be? Haley shrugged, grinning. Same as always. Make them love us, then stab them all in the back. Ailey smiled approvingly. That's my girl. Always thinking ahead. They laughed together, conspirators in their perfect life, unaware of the eyes watching them. Across town, in a sparsely furnished apartment, John Holloway sat at a desk covered in monitors, observing the scene in his former home with the detached curiosity of a biologist studying insects. For 6 weeks, he had watched and waited. gathering information, building evidence, laying the groundwork for what came next. He had let them believe they'd won. Let them grow comfortable in their stolen victory. Let them spend his money, sleep in his bed, laugh about his disappearance. All part of the plan. On screen, Ailey and Haley had moved to the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine, despite Haley being underage. John zoomed in, capturing the moment of casual lawbreaking. One more addition to his growing file of evidence. His burner phone buzzed. Not the smartphone he kept for official purposes, the other one. A text from one of the private investigators he'd hired. Package delivered. Confirmation by morning. John texted back a single word. Acknowledged. He set the phone down and turned back to the monitors. Ailey was texting. The angle of the camera gave him a perfect view of her screen. He activated the spyware he'd installed on her device weeks ago, and her conversation appeared on a separate monitor. Ailey, miss you already. Roy, it's only been 2 hours. Ailey, too long. When can we stop this separate houses BS? Roy, soon. My guy says the divorce should be final in a month. Ailey, then Europe? Roy, then Europe. Pick a country. Any country. Ailey, Monaco first. Then maybe Switzerland. I've always wanted a chalet. Roy, whatever you want, baby. Sky's the limit. John watched the exchange, expressionless. Assets in Switzerland. Of course. Royce was smarter than he looked. But not smart enough. John switched to another monitor, this one showing Roy's downtown penthouse. Royce was on his phone, but not texting Ailey. This conversation was with someone named Vance, discussing offshore accounts, shell companies, and a special delivery coming in from Mexico next week. John's eyes narrowed. Narcotic money laundering. Added to the fraud charges already being investigated. Royce Calloway was looking at serious federal time. All thanks to anonymous tips and carefully planted evidence. John checked the time. Nearly midnight. He had been watching for 8 hours straight. Barely moving. Barely blinking. Some men would have found it exhausting. John found it clarifying. On screen, Ailey and Haley were saying goodnight, heading to their separate bedrooms. The house lights switched off one by one until only the security lights remained, casting long shadows across the empty rooms. John allowed himself a small, cold smile. Perfect timing. He reached for the second burner phone, the one purchased for this exact purpose. The number was already programmed in. Waiting. He hit dial. On the monitor displaying Ailey's bedroom, he watched as she settled into bed, scrolling through her phone one last time before sleep. Then her screen lit up with an incoming call. Unknown number. She frowned, hesitating, then answered. Hello? John said nothing, just breathed quietly into the receiver. Hello? Who is this? Ailey's voice sharpened with annoyance. Still, John remained silent. Listen, it's midnight, and I don't appreciate. Did you miss me? The words came through in a deep, distorted voice, masked by the modulator John had acquired through a security contact. On screen, Ailey froze, her face draining of color. Who is this? You know who it is. Ailey bolted upright in bed, eyes darting around the room as if expecting to find someone watching her. Which, of course, John was. John. Her voice had risen an octave. Is that you? Did you really think it would be that easy? The modulated voice continued. That you could just leave me in the desert, and I'd disappear? I don't know what you're talking about, Ailey stammered. But her face told a different story. Fear, guilt, and something else, calculation. She was already thinking of how to spin this. How to turn it to her advantage. Enjoy what you have, John said. His voice filtered through the modulator like a whisper from the depths of hell. While you still have it. Then he ended the call. On screen, Ailey sat frozen for several seconds, then frantically dialed Roy. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. John switched to the monitor showing Roy's penthouse. Royce was in the shower, phone left on the nightstand, oblivious to Ailey's mounting panic. Back in Ailey's bedroom, she was pacing now, phone clutched in her white-knuckled hand. She tried Royce a third time. No response. She gave up and called someone else. I need to speak to Detective Warner, she said urgently. It's an emergency. John leaned back in his chair, satisfaction settling in his chest like a warm stone. The first domino had fallen. It had begun. Across town, in an anonymous motel room, a man typed the final keystrokes that would send every detail of Royce Calloway's financial crimes to the FBI, the SEC, and 3 major news outlets. Evidence meticulously gathered over 6 weeks. Untraceable to its source. In a small office near the courthouse, a clerk processed paperwork filed that afternoon. Documents proving that Ailey Holloway had systematically drained her missing husband's accounts while filing false reports about his disappearance. And in a garage not far from John's surveillance apartment, a mechanic put the finishing touches on a matte black motorcycle, custom-built for a client who paid in cash, and asked no questions. The pieces were in place. The hunt was on. John Holloway hadn't come back. Not yet. But he would. And when he did, nothing would be the same. He picked up the burner phone one last time, sending a text to Eileen's number. "Sleep well. I'll be watching." Then he dropped the phone into a bag of dissolving acid and went to prepare for phase 2. The real work was just beginning. 2 weeks after his first contact with Eileen, John Holloway sat in his surveillance apartment, reviewing the latest intelligence on his targets. The room was sparse and functional, just a bed, a desk with multiple monitors, a small kitchenette, and a workout area with a punching bag and free weights. The walls were covered in photos, timelines, and notes, forming a tactical map of his enemies' lives. John had been patient, methodical, building his case, building his resources, all while Eileen, Haley, and Royce grew more comfortable in their betrayal. The police had stopped looking for him weeks ago, writing him off as just another military veteran who had abandoned his family. Eileen had wasted no time filing for divorce on grounds of abandonment, and the proceedings were moving quickly, helped along by a sympathetic judge and Roy's well-placed connections. John took a sip of black coffee as he reviewed the latest surveillance photos. Eileen and Haley, laughing, shopping in an upscale boutique, spending his money. Roy, shaking hands over a new development deal, the perfect shot captured through a telephoto lens. They were moving through their lives as if he had never existed, as if they hadn't left him for dead in the desert. His burner phone vibrated on the desk. A text from Jensen. "All systems in place. Green light." John typed back a single word, "Confirmed." He set the phone down and stood, moving to the window overlooking the city. Dawn was breaking over Sacramento, painting the skyline in hues of gold and red. Most would find it beautiful. John observed it with a tactician's eye, noting the changing light conditions. The time for watching was over. Now it was time to act. Let the games begin. He murmured the words to the empty room. Eileen Holloway woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows. She stretched luxuriously, her hand instinctively reaching for the space beside her. Empty. Royce had returned to his penthouse the night before, keeping up appearances until the divorce was finalized. Not that anyone was fooled. Everyone in their social circle knew about Royce and Eileen. Most approved. After all, John had been gone for so long, and Royce was such a catch. The rest? Jealous. She grabbed her phone, checking the time, 10:30. Good. She had told the housekeeper not to come until noon, wanting to sleep in after last night's charity gala. Opening her banking app, Eileen scrolled through her accounts, mentally calculating how much she could spend on the new spring collection she had seen downtown. The main checking account showed a healthy balance, just over $200,000. Perfect. She switched to her savings account, expecting to see the nearly $1.5 million she had transferred from John's retirement funds. The screen loaded. Balance, $0. Eileen blinked. She must have misread. Logging out, she tried again. $0. A cold wave of panic washed over her. Heart pounding, she frantically checked her other accounts. All empty. Every single one. No. Fingers flying across the screen, she pulled up the transaction history. A single withdrawal. The full amount. Every account. All processed at exactly midnight. The receiving account was listed under one name. Payback. The phone slipped from her fingers, landing on the silk sheets. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake. A glitch. It had to be. With shaking hands, she picked up the phone again and dialed the bank's customer service line. First National, how may I help you today? A cheerful voice answered. This is Eileen Holloway, she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. There's been some kind of mistake with my accounts. Her breath hitched. All my money is gone. One moment while I look into that for you, Mrs. Holloway. The hold music droned on, stretching the silence into what felt like an eternity. Eileen paced the bedroom, teeth worrying at her lower lip. Mrs. Holloway? The voice returned, no longer cheerful. Yes, I'm here. I'm showing that all funds were transferred out of your accounts via wire transfer at midnight. The transfers appear to have been authorized using your online banking credentials and confirmed with your security questions. That's impossible. Eileen snapped. I didn't authorize anything. This is theft. I understand your concern, ma'am. I've flagged this for our fraud department, but I should inform you that from our end, the transfers appear legitimate. All security protocols were correctly followed. Eileen's grip on the phone tightened. This is insane. Where did the money go? You have to be able to trace it. The transfers were sent to an offshore account, ma'am. Once funds leave our banking system, there's a limited amount we can. Eileen ended the call with a furious scream. This couldn't be happening. All her money, gone. All of John's money, gone. Her phone vibrated in her hand, making her jump. Roy's name flashed on the screen. Roy, thank God. Something terrible has happened. It's happening to me too. His voice was clipped, tight with controlled panic. All my accounts, business and personal, emptied overnight. Eileen sank onto the bed, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. How is this possible? I don't know yet. My IT team is looking into it. They're saying it looks like some kind of coordinated attack. Incredibly sophisticated. Royce hesitated. Ailey, we need to consider that this might be. Don't say it. Her voice was sharp, almost desperate. It can't be him. It's been months. He's gone. A heavy silence. Then who else would target both of us on the same day? Roy's voice was low. Who else would know all our account details, security questions, passwords? Ailey had no answer. What do we do now? She asked instead. I'm meeting with my security team in an hour. We'll figure this out. Just sit tight. Don't tell anyone, not even Haley. Understood? Okay. Call me as soon as you know something. She ended the call and stared blankly at the wall. This had to be fixable. Royce had connections. Resources. He would handle it. The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. A package delivery, most likely. She ignored it, not wanting to be seen in this state. The bell rang again, more insistent this time. With a frustrated sigh, Ailey pulled on a silk robe and made her way downstairs. Peering through the peephole, she saw a courier holding a small package. She cracked the door open just enough to speak. Yes? Delivery for Ailey Holloway, the young man said, holding out a small box and an electronic signature pad. Need your signature. Ailey hastily scribbled her name, snatched the package, and shut the door without another word. There was no return address, just her name, printed neatly on the label. In the kitchen, she placed the box on the counter and examined it. It was small, about the size of a paperback book, and wrapped in plain brown paper. Lightweight, professionally packaged. Probably another gift from one of Roy's business associates, hoping to curry favor. She tore off the wrapping. Inside was a plain white box, nestled within crisp tissue paper. A cheap burner phone. Ailey stared at it, uncomprehending. Who would send her a burner phone? As if in answer to her unspoken question. The phone began to ring. The shrill sound froze her in place, coffee mug halfway to her lips. It kept ringing. Harsh. Insistent. The quiet kitchen suddenly felt suffocating. With an unsteady hand, she picked up the device and pressed answer. Hello? Silence. Then, a low, distorted voice. You forgot something. Ailey's blood turned to ice. Who is this? Me. Just one word, but it told her everything. Even through the distortion, she recognized him. Jonathan. This isn't funny, she said, trying to sound angry instead of terrified. I don't know what you think you're doing. What I'm doing, the voice interrupted, is taking back what's mine. The money? Is that what this is about? You stole our money. A low chuckle came through the speaker. Not stole. Reclaimed. And that's just the beginning. Ailey gripped the phone tighter. Listen to me, Jonathan, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. We can talk about this. Whatever you think happened. I don't think I know. The voice was sharp, cutting. I saw everything, Ailey. I heard everything. All your plans with Roy. All your lies. Ailey sank into a kitchen chair, her legs too weak to hold her. What do you want? She whispered. You'll find out soon enough. Please, Jonathan. We have a daughter. Think about Haley. Another laugh, colder than the first. Oh, I've thought about Haley. Don't worry, she's next on my list. The line went dead. Ailey stared at the burner phone in her hand, terror crashing over her in waves. He was alive. He was back. And somehow, he had access to their accounts, their security systems, their lives. The front door slammed open with a bang. Ailey screamed, jumping to her feet. Mom. Haley's voice rang out from the entryway. Mom, where are you? Ailey shoved the burner phone into her robe pocket just as Haley stormed into the kitchen, her face flushed with anger. My car is gone. Ailey blinked. What do you mean, gone? I mean gone. Not in the garage. Not in the driveway. Gone. Someone stole my BMW. The room seemed to tilt slightly. First the money. Now Haley's car. Whatever Jonathan had planned, it had already begun. Did you call the police? Ailey asked, forcing her voice to stay calm. Of course I called the police. Haley snapped, tossing her purse onto the counter. They said they'd send someone, but it's been like an hour. Do they even know how much that car cost? More than you can imagine, Ailey thought grimly. And now, with their accounts emptied, replacing it would be impossible. I'm sure they'll find it. Honey, she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. These things happen. Haley shot her a suspicious glare. What's wrong with you? You look weird. Nothing, Ailey answered quickly. Just didn't sleep well. Listen, have you heard from Royce today? No. Why would I? No reason. Can you try calling him for me? My phone's upstairs. Haley rolled her eyes, but pulled out her phone. Fine. As Haley dialed, Ailey poured herself more coffee, then reached behind the flour canister for the bottle of bourbon she kept hidden. She needed something to steady her nerves. He's not answering, Haley said after a moment. Straight to voicemail. Try again in a bit, Ailey said, gulping down her spiked coffee. I'm sure he's just in a meeting. Haley narrowed her eyes. Mom, what's going on? You're acting super strange. Nothing's going on, Ailey insisted. I'm just worried about your car, that's all. Whatever. Haley shrugged. I'm going to Breeze. Can you drive me to the mall later? I need retail therapy after this disaster. Ailey hesitated. Wait, maybe stay home today. Just until we sort out this car situation. Haley scoffed. Are you kidding? I have plans. She was already heading for the door. Call me when the police find my car. The front door slammed shut, leaving Ailey alone. Alone with her spiked coffee. Alone with the growing dread clawing up her spine. Slowly, she pulled the burner phone from her pocket and stared at it. Should she call the police? Tell them about Jonathan's threats? But what proof did she have? A burner phone and a disguised voice wouldn't convince the police of anything, except that she sounded paranoid. Going to them meant explaining everything. How they'd left Jonathan at that gas station, how they'd drained his accounts, how they'd lied to everyone about his disappearance. No, the police weren't an option. This was between her and Jonathan now. And Roy. And Haley. Ailey drained her coffee, wincing at the harsh burn of bourbon, then headed upstairs to get dressed. She needed to find Roy. They had to figure out what to do next. As she passed through the living room, something caught her eye, a gap on the mantelpiece where a photo had once stood. Her stomach twisted. Slowly, she approached, already knowing which one was missing. Their wedding photo. The one from their courthouse ceremony, before Jonathan enlisted. They'd been so young, smiling, his arm wrapped around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. And now it was gone. Ailey spun, eyes scanning every corner of the room. He'd been here, in her house, while she slept. The burner phone rang again. With trembling fingers, she answered. Jonathan, please. You forgot something, the distorted voice said. A pause. Me. The line went dead. Ailey screamed in rage, hurling the phone against the wall. It shattered on impact, pieces scattering across the floor. You wanted to play games? Fine. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. She hadn't survived the past 17 years by being weak. And Jonathan Holloway was about to learn exactly what she was capable of when backed into a corner. From his surveillance apartment, Jonathan watched the live feed from the hidden cameras in his former home. Ailey's breakdown played out on one screen. On another, Haley climbed into her friend's car outside. Phase 1 was complete. The money was secured in offshore accounts only he could access. Haley's precious BMW was already being dismantled in a chop shop owned by one of Jensen's contacts. The seeds of fear had been planted. Now, it was time for Phase 2. Jonathan picked up a secure phone and dialed. Target is on the move, he said when the line connected. Proceed as planned. Copy that, came the reply. Response team is in position. Jonathan ended the call and turned back to the monitors. On one screen, Royce Calloway emerged from his office building, heading toward the parking garage. Right on schedule. Your turn, Roy, Jonathan murmured, a cold smile touching his lips. Let's see how brave you are when it's not women and children you're dealing with. Royce Calloway considered himself a man who understood power. He had built his real estate empire through a combination of charm, intelligence, and a complete lack of moral constraints. At 42, he had everything a man could want. Money, influence, respect, and a beautiful woman 20 years his junior waiting in his bed. Or at least, he had, until this morning. Now, as he hurried across the parking garage toward his Maserati, Royce felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. Real, gut-churning fear. Every account, emptied. Every financial resource, frozen. His IT team, baffled by the sophistication of the attack. His security experts, pointing fingers at each other. And no sign of Ailey since their brief phone call that morning. She wasn't answering his calls. She wasn't responding to his texts, which was unlike her. Ailey was usually glued to her phone. Had she run? Taken whatever cash they had left and disappeared? It wouldn't surprise him. Ailey's loyalty extended only as far as her next shopping spree. Royce reached his car and pressed the key fob. The doors unlocked with a reassuring beep. At least he still had his car. Small consolation when his empire was crumbling. But it was something. He slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of expensive leather filling his lungs. The engine purred to life at the press of a button. Royce pulled out his phone, tried Ailey again, straight to voicemail. Damn it. Tossing the phone onto the passenger seat, he shifted into drive and headed for the exit. He needed to get to his backup storage unit, the one even Ailey didn't know about. Inside was enough cash and valuables to start over if necessary, an insurance policy he'd maintained for years against exactly this kind of catastrophe. As he approached the exit gate, Royce noticed a maintenance van parked at an odd angle near the booth. Probably those useless building engineers fixing something. The gate lifted as he approached, and Royce accelerated slightly, eager to be on his way. He never saw the men emerge from behind the van. 1 second, he was driving. The next, his door was wrenched open, and strong hands dragged him out of the car. What the? That was all he managed before something was shoved over his face, plunging him into darkness. Royce struggled wildly, but it was useless. The hands gripping him were like iron bands. He felt himself being lifted, carried briefly, then tossed unceremoniously onto a hard surface. A vehicle. The van. The door slammed. The engine roared to life. The vehicle lurched forward. Royce tried to orient himself, but with the hood over his head, it was impossible. His hands were now bound behind his back, secured with what felt like zip ties. His ankles, too. Who are you? He demanded, forcing strength into his voice. Do you have any idea who I am? I can pay you, whatever you want. No one answered. Listen to me. Royce tried again, keeping his voice level. There's been a mistake. My accounts were hacked this morning, but I have cash. A lot of cash. Hidden where no one can find it. I can give it to you, all of it. Still silence. Royce fell quiet, fear giving way to cold calculation. This had to be about money. A kidnapping for ransom. Someone who knew he was wealthy, but didn't know about this morning's hack. Once they realized he couldn't access his accounts, they'd either let him go or he didn't want to think about the alternative. The van drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then it stopped. The doors opened. Hands grabbed him, yanked him out, led him forward. The echo of footsteps suggested a large, empty space. A warehouse. An abandoned building. Royce was shoved into a chair, his bound wrists secured to something behind him. The hood remained, leaving him in darkness. Then, nothing. Just the sound of footsteps retreating. A door closing. In the silence, Roy's heart pounded. Hello? His voice was hoarse. Is anyone there? What do you want from me? Silence. Minutes ticked by, though they felt like hours. Roy strained his ears, listening for anything. A breath, a shuffle, a sign of life. Finally, he heard it. Footsteps. A single set. Slow. Deliberate. The measured tread of someone in no hurry. Someone in complete control. The footsteps stopped directly in front of him. Royce held his breath. Suddenly, the hood was yanked from his head. He blinked rapidly against the harsh light, his eyes struggling to focus. A figure stood before him, backlit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Royce squinted, trying to make out the details. Then the figure stepped forward into the pool of light, and Royce Calloway felt his blood turn to ice. Hello, Roy, Jonathan Holloway said quietly. Remember me? Roy stared, shock rendering him temporarily speechless. Jonathan looked different from the photos Eiley had shown him. Leaner, harder. His eyes were cold and focused, the eyes of a predator assessing its prey. Jonathan, Royce finally managed, his mouth dry. Listen, man. The blow came out of nowhere. A vicious right cross snapped Roy's head to the side, filling his mouth with the taste of blood. Before he could recover, another followed. And another. Until Roy's vision swam and his ears rang. Jonathan stepped back, flexing his hand casually. That's for sleeping with my wife. Roy spat blood onto the concrete floor. She wasn't happy with you, he choked out. You were never there. What did you expect? Jonathan's expression didn't change. I expected loyalty, honor, basic human decency. He tilted his head slightly. But from Eiley? Maybe that was asking too much. From you, though? He shook his head. You knew she was married. You moved into my house. You spent my money. You tried to turn my daughter against me. Haley didn't need any help with that. Roy shot back, recklessness born of fear making him bold. She's hated you for years. Calls me dad now, you know? Says you were never a real father to her. Something flickered in Jonathan's eyes, a brief flash of pain, quickly buried beneath cold rage. He turned away, moving to a small table set up several feet from Roy's chair. Do you know what I did before private security, Roy? Jonathan asked conversationally, his back to his captive. Royce watched him warily. Military, right? He licked his lips, tasting copper and fear. Eiley mentioned it, Marines or something. 15 years, Jonathan confirmed, picking up an object from the table. Most of it in special operations. Trained for everything from direct action to intelligence gathering. He turned, holding what Royce now saw was a folder. Useful skill set, as it turns out. Jonathan walked back and dropped the folder into Roy's lap. Take a look. With his hands bound, Royce couldn't pick it up, but he could see the contents. Photos, documents, bank statements, all related to his business dealings. His illegal business dealings. How did you? I've been watching you for months, Roy, Jonathan said calmly. Learning all your secrets. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the narcotic money you've been laundering through your real estate ventures. He smiled thinly. You're not as clever as you think you are. Royce felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. What do you want? Jonathan tilted his head slightly, as if considering. What do I want? He repeated thoughtfully. That's a good question. He pulled up another chair and sat directly in front of Roy, their knees almost touching. I want justice. I want revenge. I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything. Roy's breath hitched. The money this morning, he said, realization dawning. That was you. Jonathan nodded. Just the beginning. Your accounts are empty. Your business is already under federal investigation. Those photos and documents? Anonymously delivered to the FBI, SEC, and DEA this morning, along with detailed records of your criminal activities. Roy swallowed hard. You're lying. But there was no conviction in his voice. Deep down, he knew it was true. Jonathan leaned in slightly, voice quiet but relentless. By this time tomorrow, your name will be ruined. Your business, seized. Your partners, scrambling to distance themselves from you. He shrugged. Your freedom? A pause. Well, that depends on how good your lawyers are. Money laundering carries what, 15 to 20 years these days? The reality of his situation crashed down on Royce like a physical weight. You can't do this, he whispered. You can't just destroy a man's life. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Can't I? His voice was quiet, controlled, deadly. You took my wife, my money, my daughter. Let's see what it feels like to lose everything. Roy's desperation twisted into rage. I'll kill you for this, he snarled. You think you're so smart? I have connections. People who can find you, no matter where you hide. Jonathan smiled, and it was perhaps the most terrifying thing Royce had ever seen. It never reached his eyes, which remained as cold and lifeless as a shark's. You won't do anything, Roy. You'll be too busy trying to stay alive in federal prison. Men like you, rich, soft, entitled, they don't do well inside. Jonathan stood up. But don't worry. I'm not going to kill you. That'd be too easy. He moved behind Roy, and there was a brief tugging sensation as the zip ties binding his wrists were cut. I'm going to let you go, Jonathan continued. Let you run back to what's left of your life. Let you watch helplessly as everything you built crumbles around you. Let you explain to Eiley why you can't protect her anymore. The ties around Roy's ankles were cut next. He rubbed his wrists, wincing as circulation returned, a sharp, stinging reminder of his helplessness. Stand up. Royce complied, unsteady on his feet. Fear and pain made his movements clumsy. There's a cab waiting outside, Jonathan said, gesturing toward a distant door. It'll take you back to your office. Your phone and wallet are in the back seat. Royce stared in disbelief. That's it. You're just letting me go? Jonathan's voice remained calm, almost bored. I told you, killing you would be too easy. Royce hesitated, then took a tentative step toward the door. Then another. When Jonathan made no move to stop him, he walked faster, eager to escape this nightmare. At the door, he paused and looked back. This isn't over, Holloway. His voice was low, furious. You have no idea who you're messing with. Jonathan's expression didn't change. Neither do you, Roy. Neither do you. Royce shoved through the door into the blinding afternoon sunlight. As promised, a taxi idled at the curb, the driver looking bored. He glanced back once more, but the warehouse door had already closed. With no other choice, he climbed into the cab. Where to? The driver asked. Royce gave his office address automatically, mind racing. This wasn't over. He still had resources, connections. Jonathan Holloway would regret the day he decided to come back. The cab pulled away from the warehouse, carrying Royce toward the ruins of his life. Inside, Jonathan watched on a monitor as the taxi disappeared down the street. Phase 2, complete. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Target is en route. Proceed with the package. Copy that, came the response. Delivery scheduled for 0600 tomorrow. Jonathan ended the call and turned to the man standing in the shadows behind him. Follow him, he instructed. Make sure he goes to the office, nowhere else. If he deviates, let me know immediately. The man nodded once and slipped away. Jonathan turned back to the monitor. On another feed, Eiley was pacing frantically in the living room of their former home, phone pressed to her ear, face drawn with fear and frustration. 2 down, he murmured. 1 to go. The next morning, Royce Calloway's bruised and beaten body was found tied to his office chair by his horrified secretary. He was alive, but broken, physically and mentally. On his desk lay printouts of federal warrants for his arrest, along with front-page newspaper articles exposing his financial crimes. His empire had fallen overnight. Just as Jonathan had promised, Eiley was now truly on her own. Haley Holloway had always considered herself above the people around her. At 17, she had mastered the art of the cutting remark, the dismissive gesture, the withering glance. Her social media presence was carefully curated, a showcase of privilege and exclusivity. Designer clothes, luxury cars, exotic vacations, the perfect life, paid for with someone else's money. All of it, a carefully constructed facade. And it was about to come crashing down. The week following Roy's downfall had been a nightmare. Their house was suddenly crawling with federal agents, combing through records, confiscating computers, asking endless questions about Roy's business dealings, and Eileen's involvement. Eileen had played the role of the bewildered trophy wife to perfection, feigning ignorance. The agents seemed skeptical, but they had no concrete evidence linking her to Roy's crimes. Yet, in the meantime, their assets remained frozen. Credit cards declined. Eileen had begun selling her jewelry just to buy groceries. Through it all, Haley maintained her carefully crafted indifference. None of this was her problem. Eileen would figure something out. She always did. That confidence sustained her, until the night she returned to her luxury penthouse apartment and found the door slightly ajar. Haley hesitated, key in hand, a flutter of unease in her stomach. Had she forgotten to lock up that morning? It wasn't like her to be careless with security, especially with all the chaos surrounding her mother and Roy. "Hello?" she called, pushing the door open wider. "Brianna, are you here?" Silence. She stepped inside cautiously, reaching for the light switch. Nothing. Power out. Weird. She pulled out her phone, activating the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene from a nightmare. Her perfect penthouse had been destroyed. Furniture overturned. Clothes strewn everywhere. Her designer bags slashed to ribbons. Artwork torn from the walls. And the mirrors. Every single mirror shattered. Except one. The full-length mirror in the entryway remained intact. But across its surface, in red lipstick, someone had written, "Who's the now?" Haley's phone slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, clattering to the floor. The flashlight beam danced crazily across the ruined room, before settling on a small object that hadn't been there before. A burner phone, sitting alone on the coffee table. The only thing in the entire apartment left untouched. As if on cue, it began to ring. Haley stared at it, frozen. The ringing continued, echoing in the silent apartment. Moving like a sleepwalker, she crossed to the table and picked it up. "Hello?" she whispered. No response, just breathing. Then, a ping. A message received. Haley looked at the screen. A video file. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. It was her, sitting in the Mercedes 6 months ago, as they drove away from the gas station, where they had abandoned Jonathan. The camera angle suggested it had been filmed from the back seat. But Haley knew. No one had been there. No one but her and Eileen. Then, her own voice. "Just take his money and be done with it. He's pathetic." Video. Haley let out a cruel laugh. The clip ended, replaced by a text message. "Your turn." Haley dropped the phone as if it had burned her. He was back. Somehow. Her father was back. And he knew everything. Had seen everything. Had heard her say those terrible things. She needed to get out now. Backing toward the door, Haley fumbled for the handle behind her. She had to find her mother. Had to warn her. A hand clamped over her mouth from behind. Another arm wrapped around her waist like an iron band. She tried to scream, tried to fight, but it was useless. Whoever held her was too strong. Something pricked her neck. A needle. Almost immediately, her limbs grew heavy, her vision blurring at the edges. The last thing Haley saw before darkness claimed her. The lipstick message on the mirror. "Who's the now?" Haley woke slowly. Her head pounded. Her mouth was dry as sandpaper. She tried to move, but her limbs felt weighted down, unresponsive. Gradually, her senses returned. She was sitting on a cold concrete floor, her back against a rough wall. The air smelled of dust and abandonment. A dim light filtered in through high, dirty windows, suggesting it was either dawn or dusk. A warehouse. She was in some kind of abandoned warehouse. Memory returned in a rush. Her destroyed apartment. The message on the mirror. The video. The hands grabbing her. Fear surged through her, burning away the last effects of the narcotic. Haley scrambled to her feet, looking wildly for an exit. The warehouse was vast and mostly empty. Rusted machinery loomed in the shadows, dust motes dancing in the beams of light from the high windows. At the far end, a single metal door stood closed. Haley started toward it, moving unsteadily at first, then with more confidence as her strength returned. Going somewhere? The voice stopped her cold. Calm. Measured. A voice she hadn't heard in months, but would recognize anywhere. Haley turned slowly. Jonathan Holloway stood about 20 feet away, watching her. His eyes gave away nothing. He looked different from the last time she had seen him. Harder. More dangerous. The father who had once tried so desperately to connect with her. Gone. Replaced by something coldly efficient. Dad. The word felt strange on her tongue after so many months of pretending he didn't exist. Haley. No emotion. Just acknowledgement. She swallowed, glancing again toward the door. "Hey, are you going to hurt me? Do you think I should?" he asked, taking a step forward. "After everything you've done?" Haley took a step back. "I was just a kid," she said, though the excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. You understood perfectly, Jonathan interrupted, his voice still eerily calm. You always thought you were better than me. The stupid soldier who paid for your clothes, your car, your education, who was never good enough for you or your mother. That's not true, Haley protested weakly. No. Jonathan moved to a small table she hadn't noticed before. He picked up what looked like a tablet, tapped the screen, and turned it toward her. Let's review. On the screen, a video compilation. Haley, rolling her eyes when Jonathan tried to talk to her. Haley, telling her friends her father was some kind of hired gun freak who was never around anyway. Haley, laughing with Eiley about poor, clueless Jonathan and how they were better off without him. Years of dismissal, contempt, casual cruelty, all captured, compiled into undeniable proof of how she had treated the man who had given her everything. Haley felt sick. Where did you get those? Her voice was barely a whisper. Have you been spying on me? On all of you, Jonathan confirmed. For months. Learning everything about your lives. Your habits. Your weaknesses. He set the tablet down. Did you ever once wonder what happened to me after you left me at that gas station? His voice remained even. Calm. Did you ever feel even a moment of guilt? Haley couldn't meet his eyes. The truth was, she hadn't. She'd been too busy enjoying her freedom, spending his money, pretending he had never existed. I thought so, Jonathan said, reading her silence correctly. What are you going to do to me? Haley asked, fear making her voice tremble. Jonathan stepped closer until he stood directly in front of her. You always thought you were better than me. Dad, please, she began, tears welling in her eyes. Jonathan continued as if she hadn't spoken. Now, you'll learn what it's like to be nothing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. A car key. Haley recognized it immediately. It belonged to her BMW. Your car was found abandoned at the same gas station where you left me, Jonathan said, dropping the key at her feet. Poetic, don't you think? Haley blinked, momentarily confused. You stole my car? Confusion briefly overrode her fear. I reclaimed what was mine, Jonathan corrected her. Just like I reclaimed my money. Just like I dismantled Roy's empire. His expression hardened. Everything you had, everything you took for granted, was provided by me, my work, my sacrifice, my blood. He took a step back, gesturing toward the warehouse door. That door is unlocked. You're free to go. Haley stared at him, not understanding. You're free to go, Jonathan repeated. But not back to your penthouse. Not back to your mother. Not back to your perfect life. He smiled, and the sight of it chilled Haley to the bone. That life is over. Her breath caught. What do you mean? She whispered. Walk out that door, and you'll find yourself exactly where I was 6 months ago. His voice was calm, unshaken, alone, with nothing. Jonathan's eyes were cold. No phone, no money, no credit cards, no ID. Just the clothes on your back and your wits, if you have any. Panic clawed at Haley's throat. You can't do this. I'm your daughter. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. Are you? He asked quietly. You made your choice at that gas station, Haley. You laughed while your mother drove away. You chose your side. You turned away from me. Now you can live with the consequences. Dad, wait. Haley cried, desperation finally cracking through the shell of entitlement. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please, don't leave me like this. Jonathan paused, but he didn't turn around. I'm not leaving you, he said. You left me. I'm just returning the favor. Without another word, he walked toward a door at the back of the warehouse, disappearing into the shadows. Haley stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. Her father wouldn't really abandon her like this. He was just trying to scare her. Any minute now, he'd come back. Tell her he'd taught her a lesson. Take her home. Minutes passed. No one came. Finally, on shaking legs, Haley walked to the main warehouse door and pushed it open. Bright morning sunlight blinded her momentarily. When her vision cleared, she found herself on a deserted street in what looked like an industrial area of the city. No people, no cars, just abandoned buildings and empty lots stretching in either direction. She had no idea where she was. No phone to call for help. No money for a cab or bus. The full reality of her situation crashed down on her at last. She was alone, truly alone. As Haley took her first uncertain steps down the empty street, she felt something taped to her wrist. Looking down, she saw a small note attached with medical tape. It read simply, "Survive, just like I did." A barefoot teenager in torn designer clothes was found wandering the streets of downtown Sacramento. She gave her name as Haley Holloway but had no identification to prove it. She claimed to be the daughter of a wealthy family, but couldn't provide an address or phone number. The police, assuming she was just another runaway making up stories, placed her in a youth shelter while they investigated. By the time they confirmed she was telling the truth, Jonathan Holloway was long gone. Eiley Holloway, now under investigation herself for her role in Roy's financial crimes, barely recognized the hollow-eyed girl the police brought to her door 3 days later. Haley never told her mother what had happened during those missing days. Never explained the note that was still taped to her wrist when they found her. She didn't need to. Ailey already knew. Jonathan had come back, just as he'd promised, and he'd taken everything. For weeks had passed since Haley's ordeal. For weeks during which Jonathan Holloway had watched and waited, preparing for the final act of his carefully orchestrated revenge. Ailey had run, just as he'd predicted. With Royce in federal custody awaiting trial, Haley a shell-shocked wreck, and their assets frozen, Ailey had fled to the only property the authorities hadn't yet discovered. A secluded lake house registered under her maiden name. Jonathan sat in his surveillance vehicle on a forested ridge overlooking the property, studying it through high-powered binoculars. The lake house had seen better days. Weathered siding, a sagging porch, a patchy roof in desperate need of repair. Nothing like the pristine mansion Ailey had demanded back in Sacramento. But it wasn't the structure that interested Jonathan. It was the security, or rather, the attempt at security. For men patrolled the perimeter, their movements betraying their lack of professional training. Ex-cops or bouncers, most likely, hired with whatever cash Ailey had managed to squirrel away before everything collapsed. Amateur hour. But still, Jonathan noted their patterns, their weapons, their blind spots. In his line of work, underestimating an opponent, any opponent, was a fatal mistake. He lowered the binoculars and checked his watch. 1800 hours. The sun would set in approximately 30 minutes. Time to move. Jonathan opened the case beside him, revealing the tools of his trade. A tactical vest, a combat knife, a noise-suppressed pistol, zip ties, and various electronic devices. He methodically equipped himself, each item placed precisely where he could access it most efficiently. This wasn't personal, he told himself. This was an operation, a mission, just like the dozens he'd carried out in places where failure meant death. The fact that his target was the woman who had once been his wife, the mother of his child, that was irrelevant. Ailey had made her choice the moment she'd driven away from that gas station, laughing with their daughter about leaving him stranded. Now, she would face the consequences. Jonathan activated his earpiece. Position check. All units. 3 voices responded in succession. Alpha in position. Northwest Ridge. Bravo holding at Lake Access Point. Charlie covering the road. All quiet. Jensen had come through with backup. As always. Ex-military. Just like Jonathan. Men who understood the meaning of loyalty. Mission is go, Jonathan said quietly. Non-lethal takedowns only. These are civilians, not combatants. Copy that. Jonathan moved silently through the trees, descending toward the lake house. Darkness enveloped him. A familiar ally from countless covert operations. He had always been most comfortable in the shadows. The first guard was stationed at the tree line, smoking a cigarette, his attention focused on his phone rather than his surroundings. John approached from behind, swift and silent as a ghost. One quick arm around the throat. Pressure on the carotid artery. The guard slumped unconscious without making a sound. John bound his wrists and ankles with zip ties, gagged him, and dragged him deeper into the forest. First tango down, he whispered into his calm. Copy. Second approaching your position from the east, Alpha responded. John melted back into the trees, watching as the second guard made his rounds, unaware his colleague was already neutralized. This one was more alert, hand resting on the holstered pistol at his hip, eyes scanning the darkness. Too bad, he was looking in the wrong direction. John circled behind him, keeping to the shadows, choosing his moment. The guard paused where his colleague should have been, frowning in confusion. Mike? He called softly. You on break again, you lazy? John struck. Quick. Efficient. Another guard down. Secured and hidden. Second tango neutralized. Bravo here, taking care of number 3 now. Charlie, road is clear. Vehicles standing by for extraction. 10 minutes later, all 4 guards were disabled. John stood at the edge of the clearing, studying the lake house. A single light burned in what appeared to be the living room. Through the window, he could make out Ailey's silhouette, pacing back and forth, phone pressed to her ear. Perfect. She was alone. John approached the building carefully, aware that Ailey might have additional security measures he hadn't detected. But as he drew closer, it became clear. She was relying entirely on the guards. No cameras. No motion sensors. No tripwires. Another fatal mistake. John circled to the utility panel at the back of the house, locating the electrical breaker. With a quick flip of the switch, the lake house plunged into darkness. Inside, Ailey screamed. John smiled coldly and began his approach to the main entrance. Ailey Holloway had never known true fear until these past weeks. It started with the money disappearing, then Roy's arrest, Then Haley's traumatic disappearance and return. Each morning, she woke wondering, what fresh hell awaited her? What new piece of her carefully constructed life would be torn away? When the FBI had shown up at the mansion with pointed questions about her knowledge of Roy's activities, Ailey knew it was time to run. The lake house had belonged to her grandmother, a rundown property she'd inherited years ago and forgotten about, until desperation jogged her memory. It wasn't much, but it was off the grid, registered in her maiden name, unknown to Royce or his associates. Or so she thought. Now, as darkness engulfed her, Ailey's heart hammered against her ribs. The call she'd been on, pleading with her last remaining attorney to release some funds, cut off abruptly. Her phone died. Damn it. She fumbled in the darkness. Craig? Craig, are you out there? No response from her hired guards. Ailey groped her way to the kitchen drawer, where she'd stashed a flashlight and a 9mm pistol, an impulse purchase after the first threatening call from Jonathan. Her fingers closed around the gun's grip. Its weight was oddly reassuring in her hand. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, bouncing wildly around the room as her shaking hand struggled to hold it steady. Who's there? She tried to sound authoritative, tried to mask the fear. I'm armed. I'll shoot. Only silence answered her. Ailey backed against the wall, gun pointed toward the front door, flashlight beam dancing beside it. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. This was it. He'd found her. After systematically destroying everything she cared about, John had finally come for her. A floorboard creaked somewhere to her right. Ailey swung the gun toward the sound, finger tightening on the trigger. Stay back. I'm warning you. Swift movement in her peripheral vision was her only warning. A hand clamped around her wrist, twisting sharply. Pain shot up her arm. The gun clattered to the floor. Another hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around, slamming her against the wall. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. The flashlight fell from her grasp, rolling across the floor, its beam landing at an odd angle. John loomed over her, his face half in shadow, eyes cold as a winter night. Jonathan, she gasped, struggling to regain her breath. Please. Please what? He asked, his voice unnervingly calm. Please don't hurt you? Please forgive you? Please forget that you left me stranded in the desert and stole everything I worked for? I was stupid, Ailey stammered, realizing she had only one weapon left. Her appeal as a woman. She let her body go soft, her eyes wide and vulnerable, her lips parted slightly. We were young, she whispered. I made a terrible mistake, Jonathan. I see that now. We can start over. John's expression didn't change. That act doesn't work on me anymore, Ailey. I've seen the real you. He stepped back, releasing her arm, but positioning himself between her and the fallen gun. From the inside pocket of his tactical vest, he withdrew a manila folder. This is for you. Ailey took the folder with trembling hands, flipping it open. Her breath caught. Legal documents. Bankruptcy filings. Foreclosure notices. Divorce papers. Already bearing a judge's signature. What is this? She whispered, though she already knew. Your future, John replied simply. Or rather, the lack of it. You can't do this, Ailey said, panic rising in her voice as she flipped through page after page of legal destruction. These papers, they can't be real. How did you get a judge to sign? The courts move quickly when there's evidence of criminal activity, John interrupted, his tone almost casual. And there was plenty of evidence, Ailey. Every conversation with Royce about money laundering. Every transfer of funds. Every lie to the authorities about my disappearance while you drained my accounts. I'll fight this, Ailey said, desperation making her voice shake. I'll get a lawyer. I'll tell them you threatened me, force me to. With what money? John asked quietly. Your accounts are empty. Your assets? Frozen or seized. Your credit? Destroyed. As of this morning, even this lake house no longer belongs to you. He gestured around at the rundown building. I bought it. Cash deal. The new deed is in that folder too. Ailey stared at him, the full reality of her situation finally crashing down. What do you want from me, John? She asked, her voice small, broken. If you're going to kill me, just do it. John almost looked amused. Kill you? No, Ailey. I could have killed you. But living, like a broke, washed-up hag? That's worse. The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. Ailey sank to her knees, the folder slipping from her fingers, papers scattering across the worn floorboards. Jonathan, please, she sobbed. All pretense gone. Now reduced to genuine begging. Don't do this. Think about Haley. Think about our family. John's voice hardened. Family? You destroyed our family the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive. You, Haley, Roy, you all made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. I'll do anything, Ailey pleaded, reaching for him. Anything you want. Just don't leave me like this. With nothing. The way you left me. John stepped back, avoiding her grasping hands. Fitting, isn't it? He moved toward the door. His mission complete. His revenge almost fulfilled. You have until noon tomorrow to clear out of my lake house, John said without looking back. After that, the new caretakers arrive. They have instructions to call the police if you're still here. Where am I supposed to go? Ailey cried, real tears streaming down her face. I have nowhere. That's not my problem, John replied, his hand on the doorknob. Not anymore. As he opened the door, Ailey made one final desperate attempt. I'll kill myself, she shouted at his back. Is that what you want? Your daughter motherless? John paused, then turned slightly, his profile visible in the dim light from the fallen flashlight. You won't kill yourself, Ailey. You're too selfish for that. You'll survive. That's what cockroaches do. With that, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness outside, leaving Ailey alone. On the floor of the lake house that had been her last refuge. Her sobs echoed in the empty room. But no one was there to hear them. And no one cared. John had won. 6 months later, in a filthy alley behind an upscale Santa Ana restaurant, a woman in dirty, once expensive clothes picked through a dumpster, searching for anything salvageable. Her blonde hair, now streaked with gray, hung in limp strands around a face that had once been beautiful. Ailey Holloway had fallen further than she ever thought possible. From luxury mansions and designer boutiques, to homeless shelters and dumpster diving. From being the envied wife of a wealthy businessman, to just another desperate soul on the streets. The divorce had been finalized in record time. The bankruptcy, official. The federal indictment for money laundering had sealed her fate. Any money she might have hidden, found and seized. Any friend she might have called upon, vanished at the first sign of trouble. Her lawyer quit when she could no longer pay. Her expensive therapist stopped taking her calls. The society women who once competed for invitations to her parties now crossed the street to avoid her. Ailey pulled a half-eaten sandwich from the garbage, brushed off what dirt she could, and devoured it in 3 bites. This was what she had been reduced to. This was John's revenge. And somewhere out there, he was watching. She could feel it. In the early days of her downfall, she caught glimpses of him, or thought she had. A figure in the crowd, a shadow in a doorway, a car that drove past her shelter too many times to be coincidence. But lately, nothing. If John was still monitoring her decline, he was doing it from a distance. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. She was broken. With a tired sigh, Ailey gathered her meager possessions. A tattered blanket, a plastic bag containing an extra shirt and a toothbrush, a water bottle she had fished from a recycling bin. She made her way to the park where she'd been sleeping. The bench was hard and cold, but it was better than the ground. Ailey spread her blanket, creating a thin barrier between her body and the unforgiving wood, then lay down, using her bag of clothes as a pillow. Above her, stars appeared, pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. Ailey stared up at them, remembering a time when she had everything. Beauty, wealth, a daughter, a luxurious home. All gone now. All taken by the man she thought she could discard and forget. A police cruiser rolled slowly past the park. Ailey tensed, ready to grab her things and run if necessary. The police regularly roused the homeless from public spaces, forcing them to move on, to nowhere. But the cruiser continued on its way. Its occupants either didn't notice her or simply didn't care enough to stop. Ailey relaxed slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders against the night chill. Tomorrow would be another day of scavenging, of begging, of trying to survive in a world that had ceased to care whether she lived or died. This was her life now. This was her punishment. John Holloway had won. Haley Holloway no longer resembled the spoiled, arrogant girl she had once been. The designer clothes and expensive accessories were gone, replaced by simple thrift store outfits. The constant phone, the social media addiction, the casual cruelty toward those she deemed beneath her, all vanished along with her privileged lifestyle. Now, she moved invisibly through the world, keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact, working whatever menial jobs would take someone with no references and no education beyond high school. Her days as a socialite were over. Her friends, if they had ever truly been friends, had abandoned her the moment her money disappeared. Her future, once bright with promise, had collapsed into a gray, monotonous struggle for survival. Sometimes, in her tiny rented room above a convenience store, Haley would close her eyes and see her father's face, as it had been that day in the warehouse. Cold, implacable, utterly without mercy. She would remember his words. You'll learn what it's like to be nothing. And she had learned. Oh, how she had learned. Haley had no friends now. No money beyond what she earned hour by hour. No future she could see beyond the next rent payment, the next meal. John Holloway had destroyed her world, as completely as she and her mother had once tried to destroy his. The difference was, Haley understood why. Even in her darkest moments, she could admit they had deserved it. She never spoke to her mother anymore. She couldn't bear to see what Ailey had become, couldn't face the mirror of her own potential future in her mother's desperate eyes. Yes, Haley walked alone, worked alone, existed alone, a ghost in a city that had once bowed to her every whim. Broken, alone, no friends, no money, no future, just as John had promised. And no one knew where John Holloway had gone. Some said he had disappeared overseas, using old military connections to forge a new identity in a country with no extradition treaty with the U.S. Others swore they had seen him in cities across America: Seattle, Miami, Chicago, always watching, always vigilant, making sure his vengeance remained intact. The more fanciful rumors claimed he had gone back to private military work, his skills too valuable to waste, his cold efficiency perfect for jobs no one else would touch. The truth was both simpler and more complicated. John Holloway had vanished. Because John Holloway, as he had once been, no longer existed. The man who had returned from that desert gas station was not the same man who had been abandoned there. Something had changed that day. Something fundamental. Something irreversible. The old John, husband, father, provider, had died in that desert. What emerged was something harder, colder, implacable. A weapon focused on a single target: revenge. And now, that revenge was complete. Ailey was broken. Haley was adrift. Royce was locked away. Everyone who had betrayed him had paid the price. But what remained? For the man who had orchestrated it all? What life could exist once vengeance was fulfilled? Those questions had no answers. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But one thing was certain. One truth stood above all others. John Holloway never forgave. And he never came back. Not to the people who had betrayed him. Not to the life they had destroyed. Not to the man he had once been. That man was gone forever. Left behind at a desert gas station, along with everything John had once held dear. In his place stood a ghost. A shadow. A legend that grew with each retelling. The story of a man who had lost everything, then took everything back. The man who never came back. The man who won. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.